Hello, public opinion aficionados, and welcome to Rasmussen Reports, where Americans react to the fall of the Republic. Now, we couldn't not cut a video after yesterday's stunning news, probably the biggest political news in years, if not decades. And if you're living under a rock, a jury in New York just handed Trump a guilty on all counts verdict. And it's going to have some major implications for both the presidential race and for public opinion. It's events like this that public opinion journalism was just absolutely made for. It's like I can palpably feel the Overton window creaking and groaning as people try desperately to come up with framing devices to grasp what they see going on around them. And to be honest, I think in the era of Biden, they're finding words are kind of hard to come up with to capture how they're feeling. If you haven't seen it yet, go to Twitter and just look around, breathe it in. Follow people you don't normally follow and see what kind of ideas are taking off. I think you're going to be kind of surprised. It's events like this that majorly shift the way Americans think. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, of course, there's no way I could have gotten numbers back for new question sets. But what I do have is some short-term numbers that show the impact, at least in the short term, on the race. But we're also going to be talking about the long-term implications, especially in regards to our institutions and institutional trust, because a lot of people are now saying that the rule of law is gone. Now, I apologize in advance for not preparing nice, flashy graphics, but here are the numbers we're going to go over. And the first thing to point out is that these are numbers from, before the verdict, that Americans were pretty accurately able to predict what was going to happen. This question from back in the middle of April, how likely is it that Trump will be able to get a fair trial in New York City? And a majority of Americans said no. Only 42% said it was at least somewhat likely, 27% very likely, but 51%, a majority said not likely, 31% said not at all likely. And it's even more incredible when you look at who was moving the numbers. And believe it or not, it was almost all of Joe Biden's strong approvers, the people who colloquially we say are riding with Biden. 81% of them said it was very likely that Trump was getting a fair trial in New York City, another 8% somewhat, for a combined total of basically 9 in 10 Biden strong approvers. So if you go up to someone on the street and say, hey, how do you approve the job that Joe Biden's doing? And they say, I strongly approve. Those people are the ones that think Donald Trump got a fair trial. Now, the somewhat approvers are almost there, but the disapprovers are not. Only 23% of Republicans said it was likely that Trump would get a fair trial in New York. I think that says kind of something bad about your city that might have long-term ramifications. Only 33% of independents agreed. Only 22% of independent voters say that it's very likely that Trump was going to get a fair trial in New York City. Again, I think that will have lasting ramifications. 57% of them said not likely. But Trump has called the prosecution in New York City part of a politically motivated witch hunt. Do you agree or disagree? And again, a majority of Americans agreed with that statement. And that statement has the words Donald Trump in the question. 54% of Americans agree with Donald Trump. Only 40% disagree. That's a really huge 14-point margin. 41% strongly agree, 31% strongly disagree. Even a quarter of Democrats agreed with Donald Trump. Again, his name in the question. Of course, 85% of Republicans, but look at this number here. 54% majority of independents agree with Donald Trump that his trial in New York is a politically motivated witch hunt. So these numbers, again, are all from before the verdict, but you can already start to see that this new news really has a possibility of changing things. These numbers from May, how likely is it that Trump will be found guilty by the jury in New York City? And again, Americans were pretty accurate. 53% of U.S. likely voters said that it was at least somewhat likely that Donald Trump would be found guilty. 22% very. Only 31% said not likely. Only 11% said not at all likely. Now, it is, again, being driven by Democrats. 69% said likely. And again, really driven by Joe Biden's strong approvers. And these next two questions, to me, really show the depth of the get Trump. 50% of Biden's strongest approvers say that it's very likely that Donald Trump will be found guilty in New York City. Another 31% somewhat, for a combined total of 81%. And also 83% of those people are watching the trial news at least somewhat closely, 51% very closely. Not a majority of any other people, not even Joe Biden's strong disapprovers, were watching the trial very closely. So what are the short-term implications? As we predicted earlier in the week, there would be a short-term bump for Biden, and that's exactly what we've seen. It's Joe Biden's supporters cheering and having an end zone dance, basically. What you're looking at here is our daily presidential approval snapshot. We're the only pollsters in America that produce daily presidential job approval numbers, and it allows us to do really great trend analysis like this. Little over 2 weeks ago, back in the middle of May, May 13th, Joe Biden had a 40% total job approval. Now, as of this morning, and these numbers are about 1/3 from after the verdict, Joe Biden's job approval is up to 44%. That's a really big bump. But what's interesting is who is driving that bump, and it's almost entirely Democrats. Back 2 weeks ago, he had a job approval rating among Democrats of 69%. But now it's up 8 points to 77%. And I can tell you now, that's about as high as it got. It started his term in the 80s and just kind of dropped under 80 and has stayed there. So Democrats are about as happy with Joe Biden now as they ever are. And his strongly approved among Democrats has gone up from 40% to 47%, which is also another significantly big jump. And independents went up a bit too, from 34% to 38%. And that's probably some Trump deranged independents driving that signal as well. What's going to happen with these numbers? Well, they're probably, knowing Joe Biden's approval rating, going to plunge right on back down to 40 to 42%, where they've mostly been. He is not a well-liked president, and his approval has structurally been about 5 to 10 points lower than where Donald Trump's was 4 years prior. So this is really just a blip, and congratulations to Rachel Maddow. You've probably gotten some pretty good ratings this week as well, and you can retire happy. But in the grand scheme of things, believe it or not, this hasn't changed much. And we see that same kind of signal in the presidential 2024 matchups. Again, I predicted this earlier this week. If you haven't followed our channel, the last couple times that we've run Trump versus Biden, Trump is just crushing Joe Biden. He's had a margin of anywhere between 6 and 10 points. The last two matchups in two-way, Donald Trump has been up 10. We even had a five-way with Trump up 12, which is a stunning turnaround from 4 years ago when, in our same polling with the same methodology and weighting, Joe Biden was up 10 points. That 20-point swing is insurmountable. It means that, between 30 and 35 million voters have changed their mind and are now voting Donald Trump instead of Joe Biden. There's just no way that Joe Biden can win if those numbers hold up. Now, these numbers are not yet published, and they're the 3 nights that are going to be in our next matchup coming next week. But what's interesting, and what really never happens to us, is for major news to come out in the middle of a polling set. And so these May 30th numbers are actually all from last night after the verdict was released. And it's safe to assume that many of those people knew about it. And, they're all still in line. I think the headline here is that Trump's lead has dropped a little bit from 10 points to now 5 points. And it's mostly from an increase in Joe Biden's support. He was getting in the mid 30s in the 5-way and the high 30s, 39 in the 2-way. He's now up to 43% and 39% respectively. And in the 5-way matchup, Donald Trump is still up 5 points. Now, this 2-point lead in the 5-way matchup from last night is the lowest we've seen, and it could be a result of the verdict, and it could just be noise. But this is exactly what I predicted, is that Donald Trump's lead would tighten. Now, what are the considerations of that? First, I never expected Donald Trump to keep a 10-point lead going into the fall. There's going to be so much money dumped into this race and so much water carrying by the mainstream media press. There's just no way he was going to keep a 10-point lead. But still, it should have been a comfortable one. So I expected to see this race narrow, and it did. Will it narrow more? We'll get into that in a minute. But I think what you're really going to see is that right now, the corporate media is looking for anything at all they can use to defeat Donald Trump. And believe it or not, this criminal conviction hasn't taken him out of the race. But what's going to happen next is that there are going to be plenty of calls for him to step down. And if you're, let's say, not an independent public opinion journalist, and you're instead the owner of a polling data aggregator that's carefully cultured to have right now a very narrow Trump lead or to show the race as a wash, it's actually now going to look like Trump is losing if these numbers play out in other people's polling. So that's what they're going to say, that they're going to say that Trump is losing now. He's not fit to be the candidate. He needs to step out of the race, and they're going to try and do a Republican switcheroo. And one more point before we get into the long-term implications is let's look back again at May 13 and at Democrats. Why were they so glum to begin with? Look at these right track and wrong direction numbers. They were actually just at parity. They're guys in the White House, but only 46% of Democrats said the country was headed in the right track. 46% said wrong direction. And now those numbers are up big, of course, because of this trial. Right track is up to 53%. Wrong direction is down to 41%. So that's a 12-point swing, a really huge swing. Democrats are now optimistic about the direction of the country, and can only be because of the conviction. But why were they so glum back in the middle of May? Here's the tough reality for Democrat voters. Joe Biden has not helped the economy in a way that affects most Americans. The stock market, I'm sorry, just doesn't mean much for people who are struggling to buy their groceries. And there's still thousands of people pouring across the border every day. And people have been telling us for years that they're worried about the weaponization of the legal system. All these problems subsist. And Donald Trump was beating their guy handily in the polls and probably still will. And the real tough news is that there's nobody to bail them out. In our latest video, we covered it. Now, for the first time, a majority of Democrats actually want Joe Biden replaced on the ticket. But the problem is that there's no other viable candidate. We've tried all the names, and none of them can win against Donald Trump in a matchup. And Democrats can't even agree on who their best candidate is. Michelle Obama only gets 21% of the Democrats' choice. So they're still in that predicament. Guilty verdict or no. And when the buzz wears off, I think what we're going to find is that Joe Biden's right back to where he started. Now, we had plenty of polling to predict that this really wouldn't have long-term implications. Donald Trump is currently on trial in New York City. In terms of this year's presidential election, has the New York trial made you more likely or less likely to vote for Trump? 32% say more likely, 26% say less. So more voters say more likely than less. 40% say not much difference. And the combined total of these two numbers here, 72% of U.S. likely voters say this trial will only make them more likely to vote for Trump or it'll have no difference. And the people who say that they'll be less likely to vote for Trump are mostly Democrats and people who have unfavorable opinions of Donald Trump. People with favorable and somewhat favorable impressions of Donald Trump say they're going to be more likely to vote Trump. And look at this. Somewhat favorables say 41% more likely to 15% less likely. So at the very worst, these numbers you could say, I think, are a wash and don't really say anything. Certainly not a signal about people not wanting to vote for him because now he's been convicted. If Trump is found guilty in the New York trial, should he still be the Republican candidate for president? And Americans are split 45% to 46%. Democrats, 75% support Trump. This is about the same number of never Trump Republicans. And Trump's getting 19% from Democrats, which is, within spitting distance of the number of Democrats who could cross over. And independents are split here. So I think now that there's been a conviction, again, this is probably where those few points that Trump has lost are coming from. But so much stuff is going to happen in this cycle. I think it's fair to say Trump's probably going to get that support back. So again, here we are. We've called it an all or nothing tactic, but the Democrats look like they're using every tool in their disposal to take out Trump, and they haven't yet. And so this is going to continue. I think it's pretty easy to say at this point, they're going to try and throw him in jail. A friend of our channel, Scott Adams, creator of Dilbert, follow on Twitter if you're not, I think really has his finger on the pulse of American public opinion, especially right now. And what he said is that he feels a lot of energy And that energy is trying to find a way to be directed. It's looking for an outlet. And I think he's absolutely 100% right, because yesterday feels to me a lot like a similar date in our not too distant history, November 3rd, 2020. I think a lot of people that night were very frustrated about what they saw. To many people, it looked like the election in the swing states was stolen from Donald Trump when he was leading. And they had a lot of evidence to support that. And by the way, we're the only public opinion professionals who polls on the issue of election integrity. So check our numbers out. But there was a lot of energy then, too. And looking back, if you asked, well, where did that energy get directed? A lot of people would say January 6th. And I think that's the wrong answer, because I've polled on January 6th a lot. And to be frank, most people have forgotten about it. And if you ask, they're probably going to tell you about how it was a Fedsurrection, or people are still sitting in jail, rotting as political prisoners, and not a whole lot about, the underlying subtext of what was going on there. To me, where did the real energy go? A lot of people abandoned mainstream media. A lot of people abandoned their trust in parties and institutions. And what happened over the last 3 years is that the American public has now been convinced that their elections are stealable, that their institutions are corrupt, that their systems of justice are being weaponized against political opponents. That's where that energy has gone over the last couple of years. And I'll tell you, based on yesterday, I think there's new energy, and it's going to be seeking new outlets. But the problem is that American public opinion is already there. It doesn't need to be changed anymore. A majority of Americans are concerned about cheating an election. A lot of Americans do not trust the federal government. And that's why I think there's a new normal that Republican politicians need to come to terms to. It's not good enough to look at this and say, well, perhaps it'll be weaponized against Democrats. Republican voters and most independents know it will never be weaponized by Republicans. They know that. It's not enough to say, well, this has destroyed our rule of law. How can Americans who lived through the COVID pandemic, the Summer of Love riots where cities were being burned, things like Kyle Rittenhouse and things like Hunter Biden skating on literally everything, Americans, even by a majority, think the president in the Oval Office now has profited personally from his ties with Chinese communist companies. So Republican leaders, you can't look at the conservative mass and expect your words or logic to matter anymore. You already have the majority public opinion, which is why I think people are having a hard time putting all of their feelings into words right now. I think all of these words have been said. I saw somebody say that this year they're going to crawl on broken glass to vote for Donald Trump. Did you not do that in 2020? People don't want to hear about that anymore. They want to see action. And as Exhibit A, I would submit the tweet that Ron DeSantis made last night, which, believe it or not, looked like, fine. It was a great tweet. But it looked like on Twitter, it was on its way to being ratioed before it got retweeted by Elon Musk. So here's the other thing I would leave you with. If people aren't going to be able to find the right words to explain this particular moment in American history, maybe symbols would capture the feeling, because symbols are really powerful. Remember the red and blue F symbol that everybody was sharing the day after the 2020 election? Remember the FJB chants that were breaking out across the country in sports arenas? One of the things I saw a lot of last night was an upside down American flag. Maybe if yesterday hit you really hard, like, here's some tough news. It doesn't look like anybody is coming to save you. It doesn't look like Republicans are all of a sudden going to reverse all of their history on doing nothing about these issues. Use the laptop from hell as Exhibit B. Like, seriously, it's not going to happen. So maybe adopting those symbols is one of the best things you can do. But I can tell you again that logic is probably not going to work. If you look around yourself and see that you're trying to use logic and reason in an echo chamber, you've already reached those people. If you're upset, it's time to get out of your digital ghettos and take some action. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. This is pretty long for our channel. Usually we like to keep our public opinion news in short little snippets. And let me tell you, we are open for business. So if you have any question ideas, especially after this trial, post them in the YouTube comments, and follow us on Rumble too if you haven't. It's the same content, except over there we're allowed to post our Steve Bannon interviews. Thank you, YouTube, and thank you for watching.